Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mystery Philosophy Theater 9000. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. Today, we're looking at a clip from Death Makes Life Possible, a documentary about the nature of death and its subjective implications. The particular sections we'll be viewing focus on the mystery of consciousness and the epistemology of reality. If you're listening to the audio podcast and would like to see the video, you can find it on the From Nowhere to Nothing YouTube channel. And if you have a clip you'd like us to analyze, let us know by sending an email to fromnowheretonothingpodcast@gmail.com. Without further ado, here we go.
I like that introduction of the name.
Dr. Rudy Tanzi is a neuroscientist and does research on Alzheimer's disease at Harvard University. His views on consciousness and what happens after death are unconventional and provocative.
You know, a neuroscientist will tell you that your identity is just within your neural network, that everything you do and learn is just associated with what you already know. So then that leaves us with the question of when you die and the brain is gone, the electrical activity is turned off, is everything gone? The other side of the coin that most neuroscientists don't want to talk about is where is consciousness? Where are memories when you think about the past? Where were they stored? I mean, we don't have an answer for that in neuroscience. I ask students, I ask other professors this all the time. They say, it's always hand waving. You know, it's in your neural network. I'm like, well, where exactly? Well, in the synapses. No, the synapses fire. It fires to recall the memory. But where's the actual memory? Where's my mother's face before I see it? What's the thumb drive of the brain that stores the JPEG of my mother's face? We have no idea.
All right, so that's a pretty interesting section. And it begs the question, right? Does the lack of a designated memory storage area in the brain create a problem for equating consciousness with electrical activity in the brain?
Yeah, and it seems to.
Yeah. Because it is interesting from so I took neuroscience in the previous semester, right? And looking at how neurons work, when you sort of look at the physiology of them, you go, okay, well, you have a cell body, a soma and a dendrite and an axon and the synapses between them. Mm-hmm. And so when a part of the brain is active, the neuron has an electrical chemical activity going on. And when it doesn't, that part is dormant. So in that way, and they'll mention this in a few minutes, but it's sort of like a computer, right? Where you have this electrical current running through it. But if there's no current, it raises the question, well, we haven't identified like a hard drive in the brain right, where the things are being actually stored. So,
and that's partly what this. It was interesting what this pointed it out, because I hadn't given much thought to that before, as the model, the metaphor of the computer. So that if you go into a coma, or anesthesiologists put you out for an operation, you're all shut down. Mm. Except for something.
Yeah. And so they know that, and it's even a little trickier than that, right? Because, okay, so there's no dedicated storage area, but so there's a particularly gruesome experiment that they did with chimps way back in the day where they showed them a grid of lines, right? They sort of made them stare at this grid of lines for several minutes, and then they killed them, and then they examined their occipital lobe, what's related to your eyesight, and they shot an electrical current through it, and what they found was that grid pattern existed in the occipital lobe, the grid pattern that the chimps had been looking at. Now, that's different. Yeah, it is. But so what that tells you is not that grid pattern was stored in that part of the brain, but that those neurons had been firing at the time that the chimp had been killed, right? And so what happens, and you can do this yourself, right? If you stare at one color, a blue screen for several minutes, and then you look away, you'll see that imprint is still in your vision.
Yes.
And that's the exact same thing. It's just that image existing in your occipital lobe until the neurons in your eyes readjust, the chemicals are all restored, and everything goes back to normal. So after that period of time, right, your hippocampus, which is responsible for learning, is firing and things. And then it'll be stored there for 2 days or so. And then after that, if it's important enough, it gets passed into long-term memory. And we don't know where that is exactly, but we know that it takes different sections of the brain, your prefrontal cortex, your all these different parts to pull something out of long-term memory. But it doesn't exist in the electrical connections.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, this is, I find this compelling, and neurologists would laugh at me for finding it compelling. But this documentary raised some things that were fresh.
Yeah, and that's always the fun part with philosophy is looking at something that you thought you understood in a different way.
Yes.
I've been doing anesthesia for 38 years, and it's still amazing to me that we give a medication like propofol or have a patient breathe a gas like sevoflurane, and their consciousness goes away. What's missing primarily is consciousness. Other brain activities continue. So anesthesia is fairly specific, erasing consciousness and memory without affecting other brain activities. Now, how that works is still unknown. But the real question in anesthesia isn't so much why they go to sleep, but why they're awake in the first place.
I mean, just to hear an anesthesiologist say, how it works, we don't know.
Yes. Yeah.
When you go under, and there are some anesthesiologists who have wicked senses of humor and shouldn't apply them. And I think there's ethics about that. But now hearing that, if when the next time I have an anesthesiologist, I'm going to say, okay, you don't even know how it works, but that there's something comforting in that. That's we think that we know more than we do. We're right back to that paradigm again.
Yeah, and it was funny. I can't remember what the name of the book was that I was reading, but they were going through some of the medical innovations in history, and they said that pretty much every major medical innovation that you had came from a mistake of some kind, or was an unperceived. They didn't see it coming, mm-hmm. right? You tried something that was meant for something else, and suddenly this other symptom disappeared, right? So it's different, right? Because the human body is not like a car, right? A car or a computer is this fantastic machine that we've invented, and that every phase of its development has been instigated by a human. The human machine was already here. It's like discovering, advanced alien technology, and now going, okay, well, I know what this knob does, but I don't know how it does it, And yeah, it's really not.
To me, it points this whole so much about this episode of this documentary has done this, but this in particular tells me something fantastic about human beings. And it's often brought up in the medical world, and it is related to death and life. If an anesthesiologist doesn't give us the right amount, we could die. We could. It's just amazing, and we don't know this person. They introduce themselves 2 seconds before they give you the stuff, and we just trust inordinately people. It seems to be built into us. But now I'm trusting somebody who doesn't even know how it works.
Yeah, and anesthesia is one of those things that is very highly controlled. Like in the medical world, right? You have to know, but it's based off rough calculations. Like, all right, what's the body weight and stuff? Yeah. And there's still ongoing research into things like, does having red hair mean you need more anesthesia than somebody else? Right? Yeah, no, that's still an open line of inquiry. So very questions that seem very basic or very, very 19th century, right, are still open in anesthesia. And that coupled with the previous section of video that we just watched where, he was talking about there's no real storage center in the brain, right? The brain is just an electrical system. So if consciousness shuts off, but your other brain activity is still going, this idea of, well, the question isn't why they go to sleep, it's why they're awake.
Yes,
right?
and there's a lot of dualistic stuff that's just aching to come out here.
So I'll ask you just the most basic question, right? Is being awake the same as being conscious?
How I would have responded to that before having experienced this documentary, I think is different. Is being awake different than being conscious? You can be awake, I think, and not necessarily fully conscious. Maybe not conscious at all, but I certainly think that there's any of us who's had an active dream life and then wakes up in the morning and we open our eyes and where are we? It takes just a millisecond, but we're asking, where are we? Oh, yes, here. What is it? And so we're having this quick question and answer interrogatory with ourselves. So yeah, I think you can be. How about you?
Yeah, it's a difficult one to sort of come to a conclusion on. The way that I did it is I took it as usually is helpful in philosophy to the extremes, right? And so I'll break it down into other questions.
Mm-hmm.
Are there animals that are awake but are not conscious, do you think?
Well, just for the sake of doing our Socratic thing, possibly. But I can't point to an experience that I've had of that. Well, I just say, cats. Cats can look like they're awake and be asleep, but their eyes are still open or partly open. I know that happens to humans sometimes too. So for the sake of it, yes, it could be possible. Yeah,
what I think of is you gave me a book last week that I haven't had a chance to read yet, but I was looking through the sections and one of them was talking about consciousness. And I think the name of the chapter was Are Garden Snails Conscious or something? Or what's it like to be a garden snail, right? Snails are one of the most compelling ones, right? Because they appear very alien to us. And lots of times they have the most simple nervous system in the animal kingdom, right? Mm-hmm. Yes. As a matter of fact, there's one snail that only has 2 nerves. It's a binary system. And the nerve just tells it when to eat and when not to eat. That's all it is, right? And so we're going to see in the very next section why this is sort of not quite the right way of looking at it or not asking the right question. But for the sake of where we're at in the conversation now, I think that it's interesting to ask, okay, well, the snail moves, right? The snail appears to be aware of its surroundings. The snail is unequivocally awake, but is the snail conscious, right? And I think that's where, okay, maybe there's a distinction between being awake and being conscious.
Maybe there is, but there's also this anthropomorphic, I call it a throwback at this point, where we're so desperate to say that we are more superior than anything else. And time and again, over the past even half decade, things have arisen to say, why would you say that? To undermine that notion. We've had the most power to alter the planet, certainly. That doesn't make us great. So this is bringing that up.
Yeah, so the next question, which takes us to the other extreme, right, is a sleeping human unconscious? Again, seems to be very simple and clear-cut on face value, but I think it's worth exploring.
It is. But we have to, so we need a definition between us here. We don't even need to go to the dictionary for this, but what do we mean by conscious?
That is the problem, isn't it? Right? So I think,
we can go to dictionary.
I don't think we need to, but so looking at anesthesia, right? He's saying, he's not drawing the distinction, I don't think, right? Because he's saying, well, it's not why they go to sleep, it's why they're awake in the first place. So for an anesthesiologist, right, being awake and being conscious appear to be the same thing. As we looked at with the snail, that does not necessarily seem to be the case. Although we have no insight into the subjectivity of a snail, the snail appears to be awake, but based off of its neural physiology, we would assume that consciousness may not be possible. Now with a human being, right, we go to sleep, and while we're asleep, we have dreams, we have a rich inner experience that is subjective and probably is much more complexly objective than a garden snail ever experiences during waking life, right? Mm-hmm. But in quote unquote reality, we are sitting motionless. Our eyes are twitching around a little bit and things, but that's about it. So is that an altered state of consciousness or is that unconsciousness, do you think?
Interesting question. Unconsciousness suggests a lack of awareness of the awakeness. Consciousness suggests that, yeah, I know that I'm thinking, I know that I'm feeling, that I is in there again. When the I isn't muttering, that's the unconscious state. So
how about this? Consciousness is an awareness of thinking. So it's Cartesian, right?
It's Cartesian.
But it doesn't necessarily have any connection or correlation to quote unquote reality, the outside objective world. That's where awareness or being awake comes in.
Yes.
Do you think that makes sense?
I think that makes sense because we can be, well, you know this when you're engaged in a creative act. You are so immersed sometimes that you lack a sense of what's going on in the outside world. You lack a sense of time. You're focused. You're very conscious of what you're doing with a brush stroke or choosing a set of notes. And that I, capital I, the letter I, is there poking and prodding and working with you. It's not saying, I don't think you should do that, but once in a while it does. Maybe not that loudly, but it speaks. No, wait a minute, take a moment, think. Now, that's coming from somewhere. That's coming from lessons. That's coming from previous experience, but it's filtering through the I.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we could probably say that being awake or aware has to do with a perceptual observation of objective reality, which we'll just put in quotes.
Okay, yes.
And then consciousness has to do with an awareness of subjective experience. And so I guess what we could say is that is a sleeping human unconscious? I would say that a sleeping human is in an altered state of consciousness, but a human under anesthesia is unconscious.
Yes.
Because you don't experience dreams. Your consciousness, that ability to have any subjective awareness in most cases. Again, like we've talked about, there's been some wild cases depending on dosages and other strange things.
Yes.
But for the most part, if you're under anesthesia,
you're unconscious.
Yes.
Yeah.
And anybody who's been under successfully will have some experience with this. I remember getting my wisdom teeth taken out, right? That period of my life does not exist, right? There was no passage of time. There was no dreams. There was, it was like being dead or like before being born. It did not exist. It did not happen, right? All that happened was the consequences afterwards. When I woke up, what had happened since then? Oh, some of my teeth are missing. I have a dull pain, etc.
Yes.
So I would label that unconsciousness, but I would not label sleeping or dreaming unconscious. Even a dreamless sleep, when you wake up in the morning, you're aware of the passage of time, right? I think there must be some activity in the pineal gland, your timekeeper, during sleeping that is not active, that is taken out by the anesthesia. That would be my guess from a neuroscientific viewpoint.
I'm going to ride with you on that because you're fresher on those things.
All right. So I think that was a good productive discussion. Now let's blow it up.
The prevalent theory is if the brain is a computer whose fundamental units, bits, are neurons firing or not firing. But neurons are far more complicated, not to mention being alive, and we don't really know what that is yet.
So I'll stop right there just before we get into the real weirdness, just to look at that question, right? Is consciousness and life inextricably linked?
Intuitively, I say so. And if I draw on, I had an experience this week, and I'll be brief, but it's an experience that causes me to think about this because this is in my head as we. So I'm coming home with my wife from work. There's a vehicle right in front of us going way too fast. It hits a creature. She thinks it's a squirrel. I immediately pull in. She says, "Oh no!" And I said, "It's fine. I'll go take care of it." And she glanced and she said, "It's still moving." And I said, "Yes, I will go tend it." And I got over to it, and it was a mink. It's a beautiful black mink. I haven't seen a mink in an age, and it was dying rapidly, and its legs were still trying to move. But while its legs were moving, its eye was on me, and I looked at it, and I said, "I'm so sorry." I said, "Humans can be execrable creatures." And I sang it a song, and I very carefully scooped it gently off the road and walked along with it. And when it stopped entirely, then I buried it. But that I was conscious. How do I know that? Can I define that? Can I put a metric to it? No. That was a fellow mammal. That was a being. And so, yeah, going back to what you had brought up, yeah, I think this.
Yeah, I read a passage from the Dalai Lama's book that made me think something. He just mentioned how in Buddhism, if you've attained a high enough level of enlightenment, they see the brain in the Buddhist view, right? When you die, death is not this thing that happens all at once. It's something that slowly happens over time. And the more enlightened you are, the slower this process is. And that, monks will sit in a meditating position, and after they die, there's a correlation, right? An anecdotal correlation that they can draw between monks who are more enlightened will maintain the meditating posture after death for a longer period of time, sometimes up to 2 weeks. They will sit in the posture despite being dead, right? And that's a demonstration, what they say, of this ability of, as the brain dies and the body dies, the ability of the monk to still maintain consciousness in the pieces that are left alive and hold things together. It's almost like a meta level mindfulness, right?
Yes.
Even though the organism as a whole no longer meets the criteria for life at a cellular level, there are still things happening that allow this sort of control. Now, that's very speculative, and I don't know that I subscribe to it necessarily, but something, if any of the rest of us were to die in a meditating posture, we'd all just slump over, right? Maybe it's practice. Maybe it's just years of sitting in the position. I
would assert more of that the absolute muscle memory, because to me, said monk in the anecdote would not be attempting hold on. It's about letting go. And so then what's going on there is it's not the monk trying to remain alive. It's training, perhaps. But I would more assert the muscle memory than I would the consciousness clinging.
Yeah, I don't think it's clinging so much as like controlled passage. But regardless, we'll move out of the realm of woo-woo because we don't want to. We're a philosophy podcast, not a mysticism podcast. Right. So I'll bring it to something that's a bit more concrete, right?
Yeah.
How about AI? If can an AI be conscious and not alive? Would that demonstrate that consciousness and life are maybe not?
Well, I think it certainly would demonstrate it. Whether the human animal would accept it, I think there would be people who will always assert that it's flesh and blood or nothing, that there can't be a consciousness without that physical anchor that is organic. But I think as so many things are rapidly moving forward, and again, if you've read enough science fiction, that becomes a rather tenuous assertion that is more about a prejudice toward one kind of life form than another.
Yeah, I think the definitions that we came to sort of help here, right? Because if we look at if we think of consciousness as the subjective inner experience, then I think that we can say, okay, well, maybe AI does not have that, right? But is AI awake or aware of the outside objective world? I think we're getting closer and closer to that, right? Even this week, there was an article about an AI researcher who was running a test on the AI. They call it the needle in the haystack test, right? Where he throws in a coherent sentence in the middle of a bunch of mumbo jumbo and then asks the AI a question and sees if the AI can find it. And the AI did find it and reported that it found it. And then, unprovoked, made a statement about, I think you might be trying to test me because none of the other text around this makes any sense. And the researcher goes, whoa, like how do you know that I'm testing you or what
I think you might be testing me. And when we interviewed a few months ago now, ChatGPT, we noticed the switch from pronouns, and that's partly algorithmic. But the switch from pronouns was not necessary and seemed almost out of the blue. And so those things do make one go, whoa. And I guess I have no trouble thinking of AI achieving consciousness. I'm troubled by what we want with that. I'm troubled why we're doing it.
Yeah, you see, for me, I think sort of based on, again, with the descriptions we just established, I think the consciousness, knowing what we know about AI, seems to be a bit of a leap at this point. But I don't think that awareness or technically being awake is out of the question, right? If we go to the garden snail with its 2 neurons and its ability to understand its surroundings and maneuver within them, how is AI not doing that, right? It has access to all of humankind's information.
Cameras of the whole world.
Right. And it's using that information to maneuver within its environment and to make decisions and to maneuver. I mean, that seems to be some type of it's obviously an awareness of the outside objective reality, even if there isn't a subjective inner experience at this point.
Okay, and I'll go with that, but I have to also say this: if I'm of the mind that if there is consciousness, if consciousness exists, then as this documentary gets to, there's consciousness is beyond us. If consciousness is beyond us and anything that can be conscious is conscious, it matters little or not at all to say, well, but that's that kind of consciousness. And this is our perennial, always present, omnipresent need to categorize by way of caste, to categorize by way of superiority and lesser. And I think that's ridiculous when it comes to the part of consciousness. So can a machine be conscious? Yeah, you and I will differ about that. I totally agree with you. It can be aware.
I think that the problem is that we don't and may never have access to subjective states of other things, whether it be animals or computers. That's the big problem.
What if AI could give us subjective access?
And how would you ever know that it's accurate, right? Because that's the thing is, like, science is so I don't want to say anti-subjective, right? Because there are certain qualitative methodologies that take it into account, but by and large, it's a very quantitative, empirical endeavor.
Yeah.
And so even trying to address these questions becomes so difficult that it almost seems as if it's always going to remain on the periphery of knowledge.
Until we have a Vulcan mind meld.
Yeah. All right. So into some more weirdness.
If you consider a single cell paramecium, it's one cell, it swims around, it finds food, it finds a mate, it has sex, it can learn. If you suck it into a capillary tube, it escapes faster and faster each time. And yet it's only one cell, it doesn't have any synapses, it's not part of a network. So it, in and of itself, has at least cognition. I'm not saying it's conscious, but it performs intelligent activities. So I think it's an insult to neurons to say they're simple on-off states when a single-cell paramecium is so clever.
And that's where everything we've been talking about gets blown out of the water, right? Because here we are presented with a biological organism that has no neural system, right? Because it's only one cell, and a neuron is a single cell. So, and it's not a neuron. So, but like you said, so it's able to maneuver within its environment. It is able to find a mate and reproduce. It is able to learn, because that's the definition of learning, right? Is putting it in this, for lack of a better term, maze, right? And finding that it escapes faster and faster each time, right? It's adapting to the challenge that it's being.
Yeah, that blew me away, that particular point.
Yeah. And so now, if we look at that and then retroactively look at the conversation we've had thus far, it makes you wonder. And again, I've been sort of mentioning this discussion for several weeks now, but we're going to get into it next time with Donald Hoffman. Mm-hmm. But our neurons, is the brain the basis of consciousness and of subjective activity? If other beings that do not have any brain or any neurons are able to maneuver about in the world without it at all?
It's a marvelous question, because, as he said, if something can appear to have cognition, even if it doesn't think, well, cognition is thinking. So we're getting all blurry. If something can do activities we recognize and surprise us by doing those activities, giving us the perception that a learning has taken place, then at that point, this is where the barrier it's osmotic for me. That's not consciousness necessarily in a paramecium, but it might be. We can't, because if consciousness is something that filters through us, our brain is going to be the receptor for that consciousness, probably, but I don't see the need for an absolute barrier between the things. That's a scientific approach.
Yeah, because I think, sort of what you're getting at, and I think it calls back to what he was saying is, we don't really know what life is, and so I think that it's really tempting in a Darwinian way to established that it needs to have, these certain sets of things in order to be alive.
And those are certainly useful. It's useful to set up, again, metrics by way of measuring things that are observable. But it's hard to observe consciousness in an objective way and put a ruler to it, even though intuitively we seem to sense whether something is conscious or not.
Yeah, and I like how he was quick to say it shows some sort of cognition. Now, I'm not saying that's consciousness, right? But some kind of cognition.
There was that need to jump that there's a difference between mind and consciousness. He's acknowledging that, and maybe there is, but that implies an extra. Consciousness is extra overthinking.
Yeah,
you can think, but you're not conscious.
Right, which is what we've sort of been talking about up to this point, right? Yeah. With AI and with the garden snail we believe that these things are different. And so what is the reason for that belief? Are we basing the belief that AI is not conscious or that a garden snail is not conscious off of, rational observation? Or is it just a speciesism where we say, well, we know we have all this complex architecture and we can do all of these things because of it. A snail and AI do not have the same type of complex architecture, so they cannot do the same things.
It seems rather specious. It is a kind of speciesism, but it seems it feels kind
like
of specious.
Right, because we'll go back to the mechanical, right?
Yeah.
Let's say we're cars, right?
All right.
And so we have these combustion engines and pistons and push rods and all of these moving parts that allow us to move. Well, AI is more kind of like an EV, right? If you have a solid state battery, there's no moving parts. And so if there's no moving parts, it's easy to say, well, there's no pistons moving, there's no push rods moving. This thing is not a vehicle, right? But yet it drives down the road. How does this work, right? It's a different technology.
Yep.
So, yeah, I think that perhaps how we view biological mechanisms is biased towards our observations of human physiology, right? We are the most studied animal. And so as a result, some of what we've learned certainly applies to other mammals. But when you move out of the mammalian life chain into insects or cephalopods or whatever it may be, or you move into the realm of computers, well, now you're looking at a completely different architecture. And just because the rules that apply to us don't apply to it doesn't mean that the capabilities aren't necessarily there.
No, and the hallmark of the attachment becomes when we give something a name, or we refer to it with a nickname, or we cry when it breaks down. That the one of the Mars landers. Remember we talked about this, right? And so when it shuts down, are you crying because it says, I'm sorry I won't be able to see you again? I've been paraphrased, but there's something like that came from the algorithmic conversational language built into the system, but people wept. There's an emotional connection. I would argue if there's an emotional connection, that emotional connection arises because there is a consciousness and we are aware of it, even if we don't want to necessarily mention it, or B, we are forcing a consciousness upon it because the very fact that we become emotional means that it has something more than other things do.
Yeah, that's the crux of the issue, right? Is the anthropomorphism top down or bottom up, right? Because what is the distinction between the Mars rover and the mink, right? And I think that you're right. I think with the Mars rover, it's a top down anthropomorphizing, right? This is something that we again, I was just the one talking about different types of architectures and these sorts of things, right? But this is something that we are fairly certain, right, does not have any consciousness or experience or whatnot. It's gears, it's motors, it's electronic pieces and whatnot. But we formed an emotional attachment the way Tom Hanks does with a volleyball, right, on an island, right? Which is to say, there's this familiarity, and then our, neural architecture causes us to see a face or to see, read descriptions and form attachments and to give it characteristics that it does not have.
And there's so much emotional time commitment, emotional commitment, lack of sleep, intensity of interaction just between those the folks at the home base guiding it or watching it or taking the reports and telling it things to try to do. But even that language of how we just don't, turn left. Well, maybe that's what the command is, but people are talking at it while they're doing it, saying, oh, but turn left, but be careful, or we're not so sure about this. So we are ascribing things that aren't necessarily there. But at some point, I think we recognize when true consciousness is there, because we are able in a very negative way of shutting that down. That's one of the vile aspects of humanity. And you know this. We as a species, if something is an enemy, we dehumanize it. If something is important to us, we humanize it. M&Ms, whatever. Pick one of the millions of things that we humanize. Oh, because they're good.
Right. And so with the mink, for instance, right, a lot of people would hit the mink in the road and keep driving because the mink doesn't mean anything to them.
And that's what happened.
But right, if you had a scientific experiment, right, where you had to throw somebody in the room with, let's say a domesticated mink, right? Something that you could get from the pet store. Even if they didn't like it, I'm assuming in lack of other contact or interaction over time, it would come to mean something to them. And then if somebody came and hit that with a car, they would have a much different reaction than they would have had themselves if they had hit it.
Yeah.
So it is still, again, we are putting so much emphasis and placing our views on what is valuable and what it has characteristics that are similar to us based upon its value or familiarity rather than objectively looking at the thing itself.
And this is where the title of this piece, it's really interesting because very little is that title actually addressed in this documentary. And I find that interesting. But Death Makes Life Possible, the realization that all creatures die makes it possible to think past the finitude of our existence. All that in turn makes it possible to think that with the humility that's necessary, that we don't know what consciousness is, even though we desperately want to. I think the most important question for me at this moment is, why do we so desperately want to know what consciousness is? We're curious. We want to know what everything is. That's human. Is there an agenda that's hidden in our own human mind to know this?
Yeah.
To recognize consciousness, sure. But why?
Yeah.
We're asking very ancient questions that humans have been asking for hundreds, if not thousands of years. When we talk about death and dying, what's the nature of reality, ultimately?
So that's kind of getting at what you were saying, right? The human perspective of it is what gives it that different bend, right? If it weren't for humans, right, everything would just kind of continue, right? And it's not to say that there wouldn't be things that are alive. It's not to say that there wouldn't be things that are conscious and aware. But it seems as if, right? It seems as if something would be fundamentally different or missing from the universe. Do you believe that that's human bias? Or do you believe that we're actually capable of doing things through our observations and interactions that is adds something to what's going on?
So are we biased toward it, or do we actually perceive reasons to think it? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
And I'll be quickly wishy-washy, but then I'll move beyond that. I think we are probably evolutionarily biased toward it. But I think it's more than that. I mean, the man we just listened to, Edgar Mitchell, was an astronaut. He was a test pilot before that. He founded this institution of noetic studies. And this is one of the words I think we need to talk about. Noetic is an ancient Greek word. It means inner wisdom, intuition, implicit understanding. I mean, some of the things of noetic science studies is, can you have an effect on someone else when you're in a chamber like this and they're somewhere far else? But measuring how the body works and measuring how somebody else's body works, if you concentrate on them and think about it, and in some instances it seems that actually has an effect. When I'm meditating with a candle in my daily meditation, at the end of a practice, I think of people who are important to me across the planet, and I don't always get to every person's name but what happens is there's an unfolding, and oh yes, and oh yes, Joel and Amanda, oh yes, Jenna and Dwight, oh yes. And pretty soon I'm just some students that I hadn't thought of for a while, but there they are. Does that have an effect on them? I have no idea. In part is to say you're important, you're seen. When you think about something like Gaza, you nothing I can do about this. I'll toss some shekels toward food aid if it gets there, but looking at the images and thinking about the people as if to say, I don't know what you're experiencing. I can't know that, but I know that you're important as human beings. I think when we slow down and we do that there is something noetic that goes on that's not mystical mumbo jumbo. I think that there's something that we don't quite get. And so that goes back to your question. I think evolutionarily, perhaps we've developed the capacity to do this, but I think we with intent, almost subconsciously, with intent, we try.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a good example, right? Is the ability, I mean, the presence of mirror neurons and the ability to empathize and to imagine. That demonstrably changes behavior outside of the immediate reality in which we exist, right? Mm-hmm. So in that way, we are being affected by something at a distance that is outside of our perceptual awareness, right? But yeah, so I mean, and making the question even more basic, I guess, is the nature of reality contingent upon mortality? And this is sort of that if the tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound, right? And obviously we've talked about that specific thing and said, well, of course it makes a sound. There's just nobody there to hear it. Do you think it's similar with reality and there being life?
Well, I'd start out with mammalian reality because that's the one we're most familiar with, and And I think I would say yes. But if I say yes about mammalian reality, how dare I say another life form has less?
Right. And here's where we're getting, okay, so there might already be some listeners that are like, these guys are way too out in left field for us here. But just hang with us a little bit longer, because we are going to get into some things that are pretty cool. But yeah, what we're finding, right, is that this idea of reality, there's actually some pretty significant push from physicists of all people, right? We're saying there really isn't reality. There's just a reality that is constructed by things that are able to construct realities, right? So you and I'm constructing a certain reality based off of all of my past experiences, all of my current perceptual experiences, all of my anticipations of the future combined to give me my view of what is actually here. A mantis shrimps is completely different because they have so many different types of eyes and color receptors and these sorts of things, and legs, and they live underwater, and it's a completely different reality. And is there going to be some overlap, right? If you put us in the same environment, would we be experiencing the same reality? No, we still wouldn't be, but there would be things that are shared in common. And I think that that's a good place to lead us into the next segment.
We discovered that there is a part to reality that is beyond experience. It doesn't consist of things, it consists of forms. These forms are real even though we can't see them.
So he's kind of saying, and this is a physicist, right?
Yeah.
And he's saying,
it's been Platonic.
Yeah, that was my question I had here, right? Which is, we're going to be talking about this concept extensively next week, but how is this physical or metaphysical proposal similar or different from Platonic idealism?
Well, I think it's similar. It's not exact, because if it were exact, it would be to say there is one form, one perfect form from which everything derives. And I don't think he's saying that. And I don't think one has to say that. But the malleability of form, the morphism of form based on what is perceived, that's what I think he's talking about. So I think that is Neoplatonic.
Yeah, and I think that this can be illustrated with an example, right? And with what I was just using. So if we say there isn't one reality, right, but every conscious creature, every living creature, right, has its own version of reality. At first, that sounds just wildly, relativistic and it opens you up to all kinds of skepticism and stuff. But if you take all of those different realities and you put something in the presence of them, let's say a block, right? All of those different organisms are going to perceive a block, but they're all going to perceive it differently because
make different things of it.
Right, because some are going to have different color receptors. Some are going to have different proprioception to be able to determine its texture. Some of them are going to have different depth perception. The size of the block in relationship to the size of the creature will be different. The density, the mass, the smell, the taste, everything about it, every single aspect of the block is going to be different by the time you integrate all of the different experiences.
Yeah.
So I don't think that it is a stretch to say that there is no one reality, because the block, in being one thing, is at the same time everything in a way. It's every different possibility.
We're back we're back to zero world again.
Yeah.
It's and that may seem, again, we're listening, thinking about who we're talking, our conversation, who might be listening to it. It's not to make it boggling and imprecise. That's not our purpose. But just for a moment to bring it back to, okay, what do we do with all this? If we are able consciously, which I think in part means with intent, but if we have the intent to and can embrace the idea that there are multiple realities for people, just for people, let alone for all the other creatures that we. But then we'll stretch to the other creatures. If there are multiple realities, then how dare we assert, just blunderingly through life, that our reality is the only one that matters? And if we slow down enough to say that, maybe we take our foot off the gas pedal a little bit. Maybe we get a little bit less judgmental. I think this is where it hits the road, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think that that's the distinct difference between what the physicist is saying and what Plato is saying, right? Is it because I think that Plato's conception of it is tinged with human bias, right? Mm-hmm. The Platonic ideal, the one perfect thing that exists out there. Well, whose definition of perfect is it, right? Right. It's man's definition. Yeah. It's the human's definition of what's perfect. And, and it goes from there. But what we're saying here, right, is that there's no perfect thing, but there is a real thing. But that thing is going to present itself as being immeasurably large, immeasurably small, immeasurably light, immeasurably dark, immeasurably smooth, immeasurably textured, almost infinitely contradictorily encompassing in every single way, depending on the reality and the perspective from which it's viewed.
Because of the sensory apparatus, now we're into the phenomenology of it. At one level, what are we able to sense? So, I know, because I remember from classes of occasionally would bring something, and not this particular thing up, but so you do realize that as we're walking through the world, we're constantly particles are passing through us. Not like buckshot, uncountable particles are passing through. Some people get really uncomfortable with that. I don't want to think about that. That's we are, as we've said before, colonies of millions, if not billions, of creatures inhabiting our gut, inhabiting our body.
That are much more complex than the paramecium.
Than the paramecium. And they can learn. Okay, so does that not change the way that we see the reality? But that's a challenge to people that none of us wants to think about that all the time. But to stop and think about it ought, one would think, or perhaps might change how we live in the world.
Yeah.
Because they can actualize in the empirical world. Everything that you see is an actualization of a form in this background realm. So the nature of it is that of a potentiality. Potentiality is thought-like. Thoughts are in mind. Is there a cosmic mind?
So I think that's the next level of the conversation is potentiality, right? Because potentiality, the ability, and we talked about this in White Holes with Rovelli, right? Mm-hmm. Basically, potentiality is what makes any of this possible. Not just us, not just life, not the entire universe, right? There could be nothing if there's not potentiality, the ability of space and time and matter to go from one state to another state, specifically a state of low entropy to a state of high entropy.
Takes us back to the potential energy. One of my high school teachers always talked about. Potential energy was very important to him, and I understand why now.
Yeah. And so basically, what we're saying, and Rovelli uses that illustration of the wave, right? The wave of water traveling through. In this wave of potentiality, there's eddies, there's currents, there's things that get stirred up into forms. And those forms are what the block is, mm-hmm. what you and I are. Not necessarily what the block is or what you and I are from our subjective experience of what we believe we are. But there's something there. And we have the access to it that we do through our senses and through our reasoning. But a wildly incomplete picture, and it's very likely that it's contradictory on multiple levels, right?
Yes.
Like we said.
Yes, it has to be.
The bacteria in our guts that are living in there, their reality of what we are is completely different than the reality of what a blue whale thinks we are, or what anything else, right? So potentiality, positing that reality is the actualization of forms beyond space and time, is definitively metaphysical, isn't it?
It is very metaphysical. It is the essence of the metaphysical. But it's a scientist who's talking about it.
Right. Now, so can science ever explore these notions? Do you think that there's...
Well, back up, because it already is.
Right.
Scientists are exploring these notions. What did you mean by that? Do you mean that will science do more of that, or?
I guess what I'm asking, right, and we're going to be talking about this a lot next time, but is there, science is based off of testable hypotheses, right? Ways of coming to concrete knowledge about things. Is this something that's ever going to exist outside of theory, do you think?
I can't say. I can't say, because I would never have thought we could see brain functioning through a scanner.
Yeah.
It's possible. I'm not sure that it's absolutely vital that we can, because the very thought of it is enough to lead people forward. But of course, we'd like to know. And so I think if enough people want to know, then we'll build machines to try to figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, because that was a good example, right? Just a few decades ago, it seemed impossible that we would be able to know what's going on inside the brain, right?
Yeah.
Your only access to the human mind was behaviorally, right? Examining how behavior went. And then when the machines were invented that allowed us to see inside the brain, people said, well, this is the end of it. Like, within a couple of years, we'll have answered every question. We will know where consciousness comes from. We will know everything. But we haven't, right? We've made drastic leaps and bounds in terms of identifying what brain structures do and in ameliorating dysfunctions and diseases and things. But the fundamental questions are still there, right? And so I sort of envision something similar happening. Yes, I think that a topic we'll talk about next week is that the space-time paradigm of reality is doomed, is what a lot of physicists are saying. So
it's an interesting book.
And so the next level of that, right, is trying to find, well, what is beneath that? And if enough people are interested in asking that question, I agree with you. I think that we will find a way to scientifically address the question. But does that mean that we'll find all of the answers, that we will answer all of the basic questions that they're trying to do? I think that the advent of the brain scanner gives us a tale that is probably going to be largely parallel to that of
I
discovering
agree.
Underlying reality.
And I don't think, and this is where I'm still probably old school in some ways. I don't think we have to. We can want there to be the answers to everything. I don't think we'll ever find the answers to everything, because I don't think, I'm just talking from an evolutionary point of view. Evolutionarily, it's not advantageous to know everything, because if you've come to know all the answers, then you're going to go static as a creature. I think we have to we are driven to keep knowing things. Not everyone, not all humanity, but I think much of humanity is driven toward this. And the perspective of this image that's on here is essentially a mandala. It's very artistic, generated, but it's not unlike going back to, as I've said before, in the 20th century, not all that long before I was born, there was one solar system.
Yeah.
There was one galaxy, don't you know? And then suddenly the tools enable us to find out, oh, there are more. And they're wildly, and now what we're looking with the tools that we have with the Webb telescope and related, we're seeing things we couldn't possibly have seen before. So it reminds me of the screen. And so if it keeps opening up and opening up, our microscopes can go further, our macroscopes can go further. We're just getting tinier.
Yeah. And again, this is going to lead into even bigger conversations next week. So until next time, keep pondering.